Hey folks, and welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're diving into the intersection of psychedelics, leadership, and organizational transformation with Dave Schoof, a graduate of our Practitioner training program, a master certified coach, and international leadership consultant. And Dave has made a really intriguing journey from intelligence work to psychedelic-assisted leadership coaching. So in our conversation today, we explore how psychedelics are reshaping the landscape of leadership development while discussing the potential that these substances have for catalyzing personal growth and organizational change. Our conversation touches on integral theory, the importance of emergence in leadership, and the critical need for a new paradigm of service and leadership in our increasingly complex world. Here's a little bit more about Dave. Dave Schoof is an international leadership consultant with over 25 years of experience across corporate, nonprofit, and government sectors. His unique background includes a 20-year career in the intelligence community, which informs his approach to leadership development. Dave is a master certified coach from the International Coach Federation and Integral Coaching Canada, and he's passionate about integrating wisdom from various traditions into his work with leaders. So in our conversation together, Dave and I discuss his transformative experience at our Practitioner certification program intensive in Costa Rica last year, the evolving acceptance of psychedelics in leadership circles, his transition from intelligence work to executive coaching, the power of integral theory in organizational development, and the need for a new paradigm of leadership in our current global context. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation today with Dave Schoof. Dave, I'm really grateful that you are joining us for this podcast. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation, and welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Paul. It's good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So whenever we do live video calls, my first impression still is that you're in a sauna. And that's partly because of, a lot of listeners, they're just listening to the audio of this. But if you see the video, Dave it's almost pure wood behind him. And he's in Switzerland. And I know how common saunas can be in Switzerland. So Dave, just tell us a little bit about how did you end up in Switzerland? What's the story there?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories. It's not a sauna, just to clarify. It's my office, but it's a chalet. Right. It's actually designed by an architect that goes into open spaces, which is not typical of a chalet. But I've been outside of Lausanne, Switzerland for 10 years. I always love saying that I moved for love. I'm married to a Swiss-French woman who you've met. She's also a coach, a phenomenal coach and somatic experiencer. And I never saw myself being in Switzerland or being married again. So this is how life unfolds. And, I work globally, so all I need really is an internet connection and proximity to an airport.
And how has it been, the adjustment? I mean, you've lived there now for over a decade. What are maybe some of the main shifts and differences living in Europe compared to being in the States?
Yeah, it's a big deal. I mean, I had traveled a lot. I'd lived in Germany. I've been here, but there's something about declaring this home. That's a big deal. And in the beginning, I think, I was totally captivated not only by my new wife, but also this beautiful, pristine country. It's like a Disney movie in some ways, and so the connection to nature was the immediate experience. Very easy to fall in love. And I really discovered new ways of relating because the culture here gives a high value to privacy and self-autonomy. So it's hard to get to know people. But once you do, it's solid. It's almost like that old Maine or Vermont kind of sensibility back in the States. So it's taken a while. I think if I were young and an expatriate working, it would be hard to find integration, but I've done well. Making efforts with the language, I'm in the French-speaking part of the country, has bode very well. Even though I'm terrible at it, an American trying gets a lot of points. So I'm able to win the hearts and minds over just with my attempt. And again, the nature is incredible. Yeah.
The nature is incredible. And years ago, I had the great pleasure of giving a keynote in Zurich at a one-day self-optimization conference. And we were at a beautiful hotel that was a little up the lake. So we weren't directly in Zurich, but we were a little north, south, east, west. I don't know which direction, but outside the city along the lake. And, I gave this talk on psychedelics. And I remember there was a participant, an audience member, a spectator, who was Swiss and talked about how psychedelics had actually been used legally in Switzerland for some period of time, which I was surprised to hear. So I know you're not a legal expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I also can imagine that as you've gotten deeper into the psychedelic space, you've maybe explored what's sort of currently possible in Switzerland. What's going on in Switzerland when it comes to psychedelics? I mean, many of our listeners know that Albert Hofmann was Swiss, the inventor of LSD. Just give us a little bit of the lay of the land specific to psychedelics in Switzerland, as much as you know.
Yeah, as much as I know. Well, first of all, just from the kind of the ground base, it's decriminalized, which is good. So, personal use, it's decriminalized. Higher amounts, if you move into trafficking or possession, that's a different game. I think the mindset has always been open. So because of the heritage, LSD, it's interesting that University of Zurich and I think Geneva, the medical hospitals right now are doing studies with LSD. And then there was a recent paper published, a gentleman, a young man who had, I don't know the condition's name, but it was this cluster headache that is so severe that many people commit suicide. And he tried ayahuasca and it cured it. And that's gotten a lot of visibility here. There's a conference, in fact, next week that I'll be going to, the Alps conference. And this is a convergence of scientists, medical doctors, mystics, the full spectrum, coming together and sharing what they know. So there's a growing above ground, activity and excitement. And then I think there's a pretty robust underground. And the proximity to places where it's easier, like Holland, like Portugal, like some areas of Spain, it's easy to find retreat spaces, which is where I often send clients to or go with them. Yeah.
And my impression of this, the sort of Swiss culture or Swiss people is they're very sort of level-headed, rational, reasonable people, right? They don't get involved in too much drama, hence neutrality in both World War I and World War II. They're quite isolated because of the mountain ranges that surround Switzerland. They like to have a generally good lifestyle. And I never sensed there was too much judgment one way or the other about quote unquote drugs, like there might be in certain, places in the United States that people know a little bit about the history. There's a lot of people in Switzerland who simply don't care for it or aren't interested in it. And there seems to be a little bit of a live, let live kind of mindset and mentality in sort of the Swiss way of living.
I think that's right. And I think also, the Swiss also were unique in the early days of dealing with drugs on the streets. So, Zurich and Needle Park and creating places for people to use drugs and then get help. So a very different perspective on the war on drugs, if you will, and how to work with that. And I think that there's a easier distinction made between the psychedelics and the context for them in a therapeutic mode and an exploration mode versus someone who has an addiction problem. I don't think that's true everywhere, but I think I see that more here.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's go a little bit deeper into your story, because you have a pretty fascinating background that both straddles, let's say, intelligence work and consciousness, where you were in I believe the 90s at some point, and you'll have to tell me exact details, but you were pretty involved with the integral community and Ken Wilber's community that really started to talk about this concept of integral theory and integral thought and integral leadership. And I would just love if you could bring us into that time. Why is it that you got involved with that community? And what were some of the sort of juicy, yummy aspects and elements of being
sort of on the ground floor of a lot of the foundational thought that's now informing, how we think about conscious leadership in modern times.
Yeah. Yeah. The front row, it's really been a privilege. I really am, I've been living in interesting times. So my career was in intelligence community. I was in counterintelligence at the height and end of the Cold War. So I had a front row seat on, and really became a student of systems and complexity. Nothing was at it as it seems, and nothing is straightforward. And what took me from that kind of career into coaching, I started seeing things at a very personal level. I mean, simple things like, I remember as a young officer going out with my colleagues for a happy hour, and what do we do on happy hours? We bitch about our bosses, and we would make blood oaths that we would never do what they were doing, and then we would get promoted into those positions and do exactly what they were doing. Or there'd be someone on a team that was driving us all crazy, and we couldn't wait till they left, and they would leave. And someone would come in, and within 6 months, they were doing exactly the same thing as the person we wanted to leave. So what was that? And I became very interested in this invisible wind in the system. And so that led me to study at Georgetown in organizational development, and then into working with leaders. And that's where I discovered, really, I was in the first integral training in Washington, D.C. So, and the first one in the U.S. government. So those were heady days. And just maybe to give a little context, integral theory, really the key player in that, the key contributor is Ken Wilber, an American philosopher. And what he did is he mapped out all of the wisdom traditions and everything that was known about human development, literally papered the walls, with all this, and then started finding intersection points and developed an integral theory. And it's comprehensive around human development. It pays attention in a holistic way. Just trying to close a gap between what someone wants and where they are right now, what they need to develop, is good, but incomplete. So what are the systems that they need to understand? What are the communities of support they need to have? So, you think about the work that we're doing, what Third Wave is doing, what you're teaching in the program around integration. That is very much, an offshoot almost, or a confluence of integral theory.
And it reminds me of Aldous Huxley's work, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, that before Huxley got into psychedelic work in the early 50s, initially with mescaline and then eventually with LSD, he was deeply involved in Vedanta and Vedantic philosophy. And he wrote a book in the early 40s called The Perennial Philosophy, where he talked about what are all the commonalities between the major wisdom traditions, particularly Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, looking at specifically the mystical traditions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So for Islam, that would be Sufism. For Judaism, that would be the Kabbalah. And for Christianity, he talked a lot about the Quakers, because they had a very sort of mystical approach to this. And so it sounds like Wilber then he was and he's still alive today, but he doesn't do as much public speaking because he's been, I think, quite sick the last 15 to 20 years. But he was a voracious and continues to be a voracious reader, and really took all of this context and knowledge and, as you said, contextualized it down into this integral theory. And so I'm curious, when you're attending this workshop in DC, what are sort of the impressions at that point in time, as especially with other sort of U.S. government officials, what are their thoughts and perspectives on this sort of very comprehensive and maybe even esoteric approach to thinking about life and existence?
It was pretty revolutionary. I mean, you think about, like in my context, where analysis would have been very good to assess threat, or in governing the complexity. There was nothing that was really holding complexity. all the variances. So this really was an entree for many of us as practitioners to even begin to understand how that could help in the context of not only human development, but organizational development.
What were sort of some of the maybe hopes or expectations, and what was the actual kind of real world application of it?
I think a good example at an organizational level would be some of the reorganizations that were going on back. These were late 80s, early 90s. There was a lot of transformation going on because the world, the strategic positioning in the world and the U.S. government was changing. And then, we were all evolving. Life was changing very quickly. So I think if you look at it as leaders were coming in and trying to change something, that the typical move would be, I'm going to show you my new vision. It's great. I'm going to convince you that it's good. And now we're going to change everything structurally. And those leaders were failing because what was happening is they weren't basically winning the hearts and minds of long-term, hardworking people who'd been there, who knew the traditions, who knew the best practices, who'd been through changes. It's almost like those old war movies where you have a young lieutenant trying to, work with, seasoned soldiers and, they don't know what they're doing. So these changes were crashing and burning, and the integral theory and some of the wisdom around managing polarities started coming in to acknowledge, first of all, the traditions that did work and having, literally ceremonies to recognize what was working and listening to what their fears were. And then speaking into those fears and sharing those fears and then bringing in what was new and what was possible. So bringing in community, bringing in new models and structures and frameworks, the walking the talk, the authenticity at the being level. These were all the key pieces of the four quadrants of the integral model.
What are the four quadrants of the integral model?
Drilled down, very simplify, I'll do it into three because it gets complex with four, but it basically is the I, the we, and the it. So that's the easiest way. It's simple, but complex. So, if you think about sustained success, you need success at the it level, the non-personal, the objectives, the profitability, the KPIs. You need success at the we level, the interpersonal, the team. That's where synergy lives, and that's in service of the it. But there's a third leg of the stool, and that's the I, and that's the one in coaching that we see is most, under-indexed, if you will. The I is the purpose. It's the self-actualization. It's why do I do what I do? It's how I keep resourced and nourished. And, my clients today, we're typically talking about they're so dedicated and focused on the it and even maintaining the we that the I is what's taking the hit. And that would lead me into, some of the other work that I've been doing long since integral and actually what brought me into psychedelics.
And what is that work? Let's start to pull those pieces together for our listeners.
Weave it a little. Yeah. So integral theory is great. It's phenomenal in opening the landscape. And there's been an evolution in the work. And even the understanding of self-development. You and I have talked enough where, the metaphor of climbing a mountain, it's like there's shadow work. There's a lot of work that we do that is solo. It's going in, it's exploring the long night of the soul. I started discovering that was not complete, that we needed relational space. We needed to work in groups and communities, and things like circling and other intense gatherings. And so I started moving into those circles, literally, and doing some pretty esoteric explorations of deeper consciousness and expanded consciousness, and paying attention to, just like you and I are engaged right now. It's like, what's happening inside of me? Can I get a sense of what's happening inside of you? And then can I get a sense of what's happening between us? And there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of intelligence there. So tuning into that and working that started accelerating my own personal development and the development of the group. So, this really moved beyond the image that human development, spiritual development is a solo trial by fire or even a hero's journey. I'm doing work on, I think there's a call for a new hero's journey to include this. So in that energy
Tell us
work,
more about.
yeah.
Tell us more about that.
So, as I was diving deeper into that, we were tapping into different states of consciousness just in the power of that field, that dynamic. It became non-dual sometimes. And it was very similar to experiences that I only had found previously under extensive meditation or breath work, holotropic or different kinds of breath work. And eventually, I've been saying plant medicine found me. It was inevitable. I was not looking for it, but it found me as a natural extension. And that's only been in the last 4 years. So I started exploring. I initially started with psilocybin and bufo, and the expansion, the capacity building that was almost immediate from that. It was a combination of healing, spiritual exploration, and finding myself. And in short order, I saw what the potential was in working with leaders. So I knew there was something here, and started exploring that. And as I was going deeper, I was having experiences where the set and setting or the integration was either non-existent or poorly done. And I really felt the impact of that. And I knew immediately I needed to get smart on that. And that's how I found Third Wave.
And I want to circle back to that, but I first want to go a little bit deeper into, there are some people who get into psychedelics, and I would include myself in this, where it opens up the window to contemplative practices, right? Yes. Like the first time I did LSD was when I was 19. And then after I did LSD for the first time, I was like, oh, meditation and yoga and all the, I get it now. I get how this could be helpful. You, on the other hand, you had decades of contemplative work, consciousness work, understanding integral theory, which is at the root of it is a lot of contemplative practices before you ever stepped in the ring with psychedelics. And so I'm curious, why is it that you now, even with your decades of experience prior to working with psychedelics, you're so sort of enthused or excited about their potential specific to leadership? What is it that you think they can help to catalyze or offer that maybe some of these other approaches don't necessarily provide or offer?
There's a lot of layers there. The first reaction is speed and efficiency and efficacy. 20 years of meditation, and I love my lineage. A deep bow of it, and I appreciate it. And what was able to be accomplished in some journeys, some microdosing was extraordinary. So to be able to work with a leader or a team even, and start exploring, because so much happens at the same time. I think that's what's interesting to me, is it's not a healing modality. It's not a spiritual exploration. It's not a give me guidance. It's all of it. And so, with good integration afterwards, you can start harvesting out so much that helps a leader from the inside out, the capacity to lead, which I think is more critical now than ever, because, in the 90s and the last decade, we would talk about the waters of change, complexity, uncertainty, and, what we're in today is nothing compared to that. So the level of complexity, the meta crisis, to be able to navigate that means you have to marry the wisdom of the past and experience, but also a good appetite for stepping into the unknown and actually be able to hold emergence and help others hold that. So that's going to be a mandate for leadership and being able to navigate that complexity. The other thing is especially with senior leaders, I find across the board, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, government, there's a loneliness that comes with that. And so the connection and the appreciation for connection that comes through plant medicine, just the feeling of connectedness has been, I notice this in my clients, it's one of the first things that they're blown away with. So this feeling of connectiveness and not isolated. And then what happens is their way of being has shifted, and now they're seeking out, they're sharing more, they're more vulnerable. And that counterintuitive move of good leadership, when you show your vulnerability, you get followership. And it's like conceptually, they may get it, but they couldn't embody it. And I see that it's easier for them to embody.
So you mentioned the word emergence,
Yeah.
and there's another word, unfolding or unfoldment, which has become talked about more and more in some of these consciousness coaching trainings and programs, one of which I've gone through, which I know you're also enrolled in or have completed. And I'd love if we could just start by defining what is emergence or what is unfoldment? And what does that process often look like or feel like for leaders?
It's huge. I mean, I think a good way in, let's see how this goes, is how I am with you right now. So I don't know where we're going to go. And I'm sitting on the cusp. It's almost like riding a wave or surfing. It's right on the edge of like excitement and nervousness, because how could it go? And let's see. And so if I take that position as a coach and I'm working with a client, for many, many years, I coached from a change agenda. I came from a position that I need to help that person. I need to help them develop, close their gap, solve their problem. And it was all on me. And it's actually kind of arrogant. So what I've noticed is if I have a shift of sitting in the belief system that you are whole and complete, yes, there's some things that you need to develop, but you have it. And it's what are the blockages? What are the things you've forgotten about yourself? So if I can help you unfold, and that's coming from my way of being, of allowing my own unfoldment with you, there's a little bit of the unknown that's happening. But what I find is that people respond almost like a magnet to relaxing, deepening, and opening. And then we can get into very tactical issues and work from there.
And it feels like the crux of this is nervous system regulation. That and we talked about this quite a bit in the practitioner training program. I teach at this point a lot, which is when you're starting to work with these modalities, for example, with psychedelics.
Yes.
Right. There is this sort of relationship or allyship that's formed with the medicine where you're saying, I'm trusting that this medicine will have the impact that it needs to have. My role as a coach, facilitator, or practitioner is to create a space of safety to allow for that unfolding. Because when someone feels safe, when their nervous system is relaxed, when they're not in fight or flight, then when that medicine work happens, it can sort of open up those channels a lot better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing it in that way. I'm having a nice memory of one of my first journeys where my invocation to the medicine as a teacher was show me. Just show me. And there was a relaxing I could feel. And even when things got very, very intense, I could stay in touch with, first of all, I'm not alone. I'm actually being accompanied and I'm being shown. May not understand all of it or what's happening, but I'm being shown. So I think you're absolutely right. It does help, this regulation. And that has stayed with me in working with some, what I would say, challenging clients in extraordinarily challenging contexts. And it's so rare for them to be experienced just the way they are, that alone has been a huge platform for then what could unfold.
And I feel like it's especially important when it's like you mentioned, you've worked with clients who are in very challenging or difficult situations, right? There might be an emergency that they're navigating. There might be, a drop off in revenue that they're navigating. There might be, a health crisis potentially that they're having to navigate. And so when we open more, when we allow for that unfolding, we actually allow ourselves to be guided. And there is this element and aspect of faith in that there's sort of this trust in how things are unfolding, because the conditioning that we've often been subjected to is that we need to control everything, right?
Exactly.
And there's something to be said for intention, choice, autonomy, creation, direction. And if that becomes over-indexed, if there is too much of an emphasis on that, then that constriction, that tightening can often prevent the true unfolding of the sort of essential self to come forward.
Beautifully said. I couldn't agree more. And as you're saying that, what comes alive for me is the preparation work we did, what you did with me in preparing for my journey, or what I do with a client in preparing for their journey, sets that tone, right? Because they don't know. And so that work of how to be open, how to let go, and then we use that as a modeling for how they can go in as a leader. So circling back in the integration, just looking at their experience of the journey, what it took for them, the setting, their invocation, how they were going in, becomes a huge learning point. I think that's why they're so memorable, right? Almost everybody can recall key journeys and what it was like going in, what it was like coming out, and how they were impacted. It's quite something.
Yeah, there's like an emotional imprint from that, right? When we have these peak experiences or these huge outpouring of emotions that are far beyond what we experience in normal everyday life, there's an imprint that's left. There's impact that's left. And that's again why this is why it's so essential that set and setting is paid close attention to, that there is a safe environment, because that can often dictate whether or not that imprint is positive or if it's negative, and traumatic. And the opportunity with psychedelics is it opens you way up. But this is why it's so critical that it opens you up for that unfolding and not opens you up for trauma, abuse, manipulation, some of these other things.
Yes. The other aspect in the leadership context that's quite unusual is with the plant medicine, it's bringing in, it's a magical experience. And whatever your frame is, if it's a spiritual exploration, mystical, a deepening, even a healing, this is a major pivot point for many leaders. And I think it starts opening things up. What I've noticed is the conversations afterwards. First of all, the intimacy, the vulnerability, the openness, even in the coaching relationship, we go to deeper levels. And what starts to emerge out of that loneliness I was talking about, but also that sense of, I've had a lot of success in my life. I should be happy, but I'm not. I'm awake at 3 a.m. I don't know why. I don't know what's next. There's this hum of a disquiet in the background. I don't know what the hell to do with that. Prior to the journey, that might have been expressed, in the cultural, humorous way of a midlife crisis that's expressed in different ways. But after the journey, it becomes a serious pivot point. It becomes a real spiritual moment, because the discovery often is it's a longing. There's a longing for meaning. What's next? I've had all the success that culture says is successful, but I feel empty inside. And that's a beautiful moment. It's a beautiful opening for the kind of coaching that we do following a journey.
That's beautifully said. So one question I wanted to ask you was specific to the practitioner training program. So you were in, I believe, our 5th cohort and CCP 5 and full 10-month program. And in particular, I would love to hear your reflections and thoughts on the intensive that we hosted at Brave Earth in Costa Rica. What for you was so meaningful and transformative about the experience at at Brave Earth?
Yeah, it's still alive. So it's very real for me. It's very easy to talk about. I think
About a year later now. I mean, we were
yeah,
there, I believe, last
just
December.
before, yeah,
So about
late. That's
10,
right.
11 months ago,
Almost.
something like that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I think what's still alive and easy to talk about is the relationship with the jungle. So just the setting itself was incredibly special. I've been in many jungles in my life, and this was the first jungle that I was in that had a feminine quality, a holding, a gentle relationship. And even, over the course of the week intensive, we're engaged in a lot of different activities that culminate in a high dose journey. But even before then, the connectiveness really created a beautiful container. And then to be on the receiving end, after months of study and training and how to do this work, and then to receive, to be held in the container by the extraordinary facilitators and you, that was as much of a learning experience, but it was easy to suspend the observer of that and just go into it. So those are the key pieces. The surprise for me was it was a hugely transformative experience personally. It had a quality that I haven't experienced in other journeys. And it even continued. I don't know if you remember, but the next day when we were gathering for integration, I wasn't ready. I was still in. Things were still happening. I was still seeing things, and they continued with me for long after. I can summon up the sound of the jungle and instantly be in that state. So it was
Wow.
So it was the best possible kind of retreat that anyone could ever have in this work. So it set a model for me. It set a tone. How I am with my clients preparing for their journeys is informed by that, which is just beautiful. So on a personal level, it was great. On a growing into this work, kind of a maturing, it was great as well.
And what's unfolded for you since then, right? We're now 10, 11 months out from that intensive. We're maybe 4 or 5 months out from, actually graduating from the full program. I believe our graduation was in June.
Mm-hmm.
What's now unfolding for you as you look at, okay, how might I be able to weave psychedelics into my coaching practice? How are you starting to see this play out in the real world post the practitioner training?
Yeah, I think it's on a couple of levels. One is I'm getting a lot of personal referrals just through the communities. So, which has been great because of my experience levels been growing. In my work with leaders and my practice is starting to pivot. So I'm moving beyond just working with traditional senior leaders and expanding it to, people who are up to something, people who are exploring, people who are finding the limits of that individual spiritual or self-development and need something else. I feel called to bring in doing some new work or working in new ways with men. I think men's work is ready to come to a new evolution. So the expression of it is starting to change, but I still want to work in the traditional leader ecosystems because I think that is one of the greatest levers for change, the greatest impact. If there is an increase in consciousness, there is an increase in connection tied to the market that can have a huge, huge impact. And also in this meta crisis, we need that kind of leadership more than ever. So in that avenue, I need to be a little bit more discreet. And so it's more of parallel to the work I'm already doing, which may be different than if I'm working with coaches and therapists, for example. But what's interesting is with that perspective of unfolding, the appetite is already there. So there's a curiosity that's very easy to ignite.
And I would imagine that's supported by media articles about people in leadership position who have started to be curious about or work with psychedelics, clinical research that has come out of institutions like Berkeley and Johns Hopkins and Imperial. There is this sense of, when I first started doing this work many years ago, it was an uphill battle. There was still a lot of stigma. There was still a lot of skepticism, and it feels like we've more or less crossed the threshold or the chasm
in many places,
in terms of the awareness.
I think that's right. In many places, and especially, where innovation has been thriving for a long time. So high tech, those worlds, I think not only is it easier to talk about, there's an appetite for it. What interests me, because I've always been intrigued with the challenge, is going into the places that are a little bit more rigid, a little bit more, siloed in the thinking and traditional, because if we loosen that, that's going to be quite extraordinary. So, I had a room full of FBI agents I was working with. I think I told you this, and what they needed was meditation. But if I had used the M word, I think they would have burned me at the stake. So I said, would a tactical pause be useful every once in a while? Tactical pauses. Yeah, that would really work. So I had them meditating, doing tactical pauses, and I had them journaling, but I couldn't use the J word. So I had them using data acquisition logs. So working in those kinds of environments has always intrigued me. So finding the unlock in a respectful way, because if things start happening there, that gets really interesting.
And what is that unlock when it comes to psychedelics? What is, just to hear your top of mind thoughts, right? What is the tactical pause if we're talking about psychedelics for leaders in more traditional roles?
It's a brainstorm, right? Because it's very contextual. But I would say how I would start playing with it would be when we start looking at complexity, the fog of war, the fog on the ground, how things, you go back to COVID and post-COVID and how supply chains disappeared. Your dashboard's no good. What you've been working with is no good. How do you stay connected? How do you stay connected to yourself? Kind of asking those kinds of questions. It's not going to evoke an answer. It's going to evoke a reaction like, yeah, right, I don't know. And it's in that I don't know that I think could be the opening.
It provides a space to experiment in a way where there is this sort of, even if it's a microcosm of a death and rebirth process happening, and there can often be a lot of resistance to that.
That's right.
Right.
And there's a humility at more senior levels that I find that is an opening. So there's I don't know how to do this, and there's a humbling moment, and there's a suffering point that coming in with compassion. So I think it's my own way of being, and I can leverage. I've been around for a while. I've done stuff. I can speak their languages. I'm not trying to change them. So then when I start sharing my stories, there's a leaning in, there's an interest. So it's something I'm able to leverage.
Well, Dave, this has been a great pleasure. Before we wrap, I'm curious, is there anything we haven't touched on yet that you want to weave in, or that hasn't been brought up, or anything that is sort of alive for you or very present for you in your work that you think our audience would love to hear about?
Wow. Yeah, what's coming through, it's surprising me. It's coming through in the quality of our exchange here. I've referenced meta crisis a couple of times, and the existential anxiety that's in the world, and the hum of disquiet that's behind most of us, at least some of the time. I think this work is critical for that. And, I think I'm reading a book right now. It's called The Hospicing of Modernity. And it's quite provocative. And with any ending, if you go back to integral theory or change theory, any ending is hard. There's a breaking down, there's a dying, there's a devastation, but then there's a rebirth and a new coming. And so we need leaders for, a new paradigm. And this work is already a new paradigm. So I'm excited. I think this is, this is where we're going. So I'm thrilled to be working with you on this, and I'm excited about new possibilities.
Thank you, Dave. And that book is Hospicing Modernity, Parting with Harmful Ways of Living by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira.
Pretty awesome.
And it says, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism. And I think that's the marriage that we're looking for when it comes to conscious leadership and organizational change. How do we direct that energy towards a regeneration of our physical environment, of our working lives, of our personal lives? I think we all feel this existential anxiety, this sense of not only fraying at the edges, but the fraying is actually getting closer and closer to the center.
Indeed.
And the humility and also the faith to allow for that, and the hope of what will emerge on the other side, I think is what has so many people enthusiastic about the capacity for psychedelic medicine to help us as a human species to adapt to an uncertain future and to trust ourselves to be able to navigate it more than anything.
Beautifully said.
Yeah. Well, Dave Schoof, if folks want to learn more about your work, get in touch with you. I mean, I know you're on LinkedIn. Do you have a personal website or any sort of place that you'd like to point folks towards?
Thanks. LinkedIn and Third Wave probably for now. Website's coming.
The website's coming. Well, I can't wait to see the website when it's up, Dave. I appreciate you joining us for this really beautiful conversation, and I'm just so grateful that you took the leap and you joined us for that fifth cohort, and now everything that's emerging for you on the other side of it. It's just really great to hear about your background, your lineage, and what you're excited for, what you're working on currently. I really enjoyed this conversation today.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks for the work you're doing. It's groundbreaking. You're kind of the hero of the new paradigm, the kind of I'm working with. So it's a joy to know you, and let's do more exploring.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Take care.
Hey listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Dave Schoof. Dave is one of our premier graduates. It was really an honor to have him as part of our practitioner training program. And so a quick reminder to head to the link in the description of this episode to see the full show notes and any of the links we mentioned in this episode. If you're interested in joining us in our next practitioner training program that begins in November with our intensive February 8 to 15 at Reunion in Costa Rica. We'd love to know what you thought of this conversation, and you can let us know in Third Wave's free community platform at community.thethirdwave.co. Make sure to follow the Psychedelic Podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you found this episode inspiring or helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to grow your own medicine from microdosing or high-dose experiences, check out our Mushroom Grow Kit. It's the simplest way to get a reliable source of high-quality mushrooms, and it includes detailed videos walking you through the entire process. No guessing, just clear instructions for best results. Check out the link in the description below.